welcome to our podcast. I'm Amy Bernstein with Bernstein Realty, and I have the pleasure of being here today with Maria Oakham with Tradition Title. And I just have so much respect and admiration for Maria. I said that in part one of our podcast with Maria, and I'm going to say it again because it's how I feel.
Oh,
and
thank you.
I just know that whenever I have a title question, I can ask you and I'm going to get a straight answer. And if you don't know the answer, which is, I don't think that's ever happened, but if you don't, you're going to get some answers and get back with me. And it is a true pleasure. And not only are you a total expert in your field, but you're a great friend.
Oh, thank you.
And so I'm just so happy that you're here.
And the feeling is mutual.
Thank you.
Mutual.
Thank you. I hope you had a chance to listen to part one of our podcast regarding the importance of a title company and what a title company does and the benefits of using them. But there's so much information to be had about what a title company does. And I think there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of confusion. So I asked Maria to join me today, and we realized that it could not all be done in one segment. So this is part two of a two-part segment. So if you haven't listened to part one, please dial back and look at it. But I think one of the things that I left off on part one was the closing statement. So, our closing statements used to be very, very easy. And then this is real estate and probably life in general. Once you get it down, the one thing you can trust is that it's going to change.
Yeah,
right?
always.
So the closing statement changed. What year did we?
2015.
And we don't call it a closing statement anymore. We call it a closing
disclosure.
A closing disclosure.
Closing disclosure.
And I remember when it came out, the whole real estate business was in total confusion and fear and didn't understand it. And it's like anything, after time you get to understand it. But for the consumer who only looks at this when they buy and sell homes, and
right.
For many it's not that often, that it is confusing, this closing disclosure, because it scrolls up and then totals, and then it scrolls up and then totals. So tell us about the closing disclosure and what it does.
I think the first thing is, this was the CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Board, that came in and changed all that in 2015, which is supposed to be a friendlier, easier to understand closing disclosure, and it isn't.
Right.
And nobody likes it. And when we used to have the HUD-1, it was very transparent, which is the irony of this whole situation. I feel like it should be transparent. Everybody should see everything. But now everybody has their own disclosures.
So you said HUD-1, which was the closing statement.
Right,
previously.
exactly.
Yes.
Right. And we'll still use those if we have a cash transaction. However, every lender has to use a closing disclosure. And certainly on the buyer's side, it is completely confusing to them. When it first came out, nobody knew how to react to it. And probably the first 2 years, I had people that were in my industry and the lenders that still didn't know how to read it. It's confusing and it makes no sense, but it is what it is, and it's what they have to use.
And it's the first thing that you present when you go
Absolutely.
into a closing, right?
Absolutely. I feel like, especially if you're with a buyer, the two most important things are your cash to close, which is your closing disclosure, and the note. The only thing I absolutely love about the closing disclosure is it's anywhere from 5 to 6 pages. Front page always recaps A, what the note terms are going to be in that loan, and B, what their payment is going to look like. And I think at least we know, we've gone over those days where people walk in and they're like, that's not my interest rate.
Right,
I
right.
mean, where did you come up with
So
that?
it's kind of a summary, right?
Right up
Yes,
front.
yes.
But then as you dive into it, then you have closing costs. And like you said, I learned to add and subtract where it went from top to bottom. I'm not sure who developed this, but everything totals to the top.
Yes.
It made it super confusing.
Yes.
And
they see a big dollar amount.
Yeah.
And then below it, they see a bunch of little dollar amounts. And what they need to know is that the little dollar amounts add up to the big dollar amount
right.
per category.
Right, per category, per section. So, I think it's confusing, and really what you want is to make sure that people understand that. Especially the third page of that is your debits and credits. So that's where you're going to see seller credits coming or seller debits coming in. That to me is the most important thing, because by the time your buyer gets to closing, they've already gone over their closing costs with the lender. The only thing is that portion of maybe escrows or miscellaneous recording fees, insurance, those kind of things that maybe they didn't know until that was finalized at that point. But as far as the seller goes, not so bad. Much easier. It's debits and credits and their closing costs, and it's much easier. But yes, I think all of us would vote to have the HUD back, the HUD one back tomorrow. Yeah.
So when I have cash transactions, I'm like, yes, it's going to be an easy closing statement.
Because you can explain it,
Yes.
right? You know exactly how to explain it. Because even though I know you know how to explain a closing disclosure, you haven't seen the lender's closing instructions. You're assuming all of that's correct.
Yes. And so one of the things I think for me, when I walk into a closing room and I look at that closing statement, and I'm very passionate, or closing disclosure, I keep still calling it closing statement. The things that I really focus on are the tax prorations,
Right.
the maintenance fee prorations,
Right.
the interim interest, and the payoffs, right?
Yes.
Which payoffs can get a little bit dicey too on explaining that. So I want to just quickly touch on that. But you take the taxes from the seller from January 1st up through the date of closing, and you give it to the buyer
Right. If taxes are not due at that time.
if the taxes are not due. So like right now, we're in November 19th. And so are you collecting those taxes and paying those bills
Harris
right now?
County came out yesterday,
Okay.
or at least the majority of our tax bills came out yesterday. If you had protested or there was something going on, you might not see that tax bill yet. But yes, Harris County was the last one to come out. All the
Gotcha.
other counties, I believe Fort Bend, everybody else is out right now. Schools are great. I mean, Spring Branch was out a month ago.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, right now we're collecting and paying taxes, so it's the opposite of what you said. So we're collecting the entire amount from the seller, and then the buyer is crediting back the seller from the day after closing through the end of the year, their prorated portion of ownership.
Right. So you're truly taking who owes what for that year and paying the tax bills.
Right, absolutely.
But early on, before, let's say January through October, it's a prorated amount based on the prior year's taxes. So there may be a settlement after
Absolutely.
January when the real tax bills come out, or when the real tax bill's out, then the buyer and the seller have to settle up on their taxes that were different than what you collected. Now, what I just said sounds very confusing, so I'm
Right.
going to repeat it. At closing, on the closing statement, you collect the taxes from the seller if it's prior to October for the year. You collect the taxes from the seller based on the previous year's taxes.
Right. We're prorating off the previous year's taxes as the proration
Yes.
purposes.
So when the actual bills come out to the buyer, because you're taking that money from the seller and giving it to the buyer, then when the buyer gets the actual bills, if they're different, then everybody agrees to settle up afterwards. So it's a difference between January and October and the end of the year as to how you do it.
Absolutely. I think incorporated in that is once the taxes are certified, I use the certified value. I still may use the previous year's rates, but
Yes.
I'm using the certified value because we know that's what they're going to be using at that time.
Agreed.
And we could do a whole other thing on taxes and exemptions
probably
and
will.
all of that.
I think we
because
will.
That is super confusing to people.
Yes, I think we will. And then the maintenance, sometimes people go, oh, Amy, I paid my maintenance in the beginning of the year for the whole year. And so we explain that, yes, the title company will then charge the buyer for the portion that they're going to own the house.
Right.
And you'll get that money back, which is nice. And then also on the payoff of the mortgage. So I think one of the things that is probably the most confusing for most sellers is that if I make a payment on my house on October 1st, that payment is for September
Right.
owning the house and living in the house and borrowing of the money. October 1 is not for October. It's not like
Right.
rent.
Right.
It's opposite of rent. So October 1 pays for. So when I go to do a payoff with my seller, they go, well, why am I paying for October?
Right.
Well, because October 1, when you paid, it was for September. So that's always a whole conversation that we have to have and explain the payoffs. And we will probably have a separate podcast about that. But I think the thing that I want to share today is what I think is some of the scams that are going on today.
Yeah.
So the buyer either wires their money in, or can they still bring a cashier's check?
Sure.
Some
Yes,
title
absolutely.
companies, no.
Yeah. So some of them have a cutoff. We would prefer under 300,000. Just makes it a little easier on our end. But everybody has a different situation. Yes, some title companies won't accept it, and it just depends on what.
So they have to wire it in.
So they have to wire it in.
And this is where it's getting a little bit scary.
Oh, yeah,
So can you
absolutely.
talk to us a little bit about some of the scams and what the consumer should be mindful of?
So when we first started seeing the scam of wire fraud, it affected sellers in the beginning, and that's who they went after, were the sellers. And ironically, we had always asked that our sellers fill out or complete a form at closing, and not really because we didn't know about the fraud that was going on, just so that we had their most current instructions.
Wire instructions.
Wire and instructions, correct. And so I think that once the scammers and the people that were, trolling in people's emails figured that out, they turned around and started going to the buyer. And I can remember people telling me I received wiring instructions. We think most of it after sitting down and having conversations with people, professionals, and even an FBI agent. We have people that troll in the public email servers like Gmail, Hotmail, SBC Global, all of those, and they turn around and they just wait. They wait for words. So, for instance, a lot of times, people won't put addresses in subject lines, probably a really good thing, maybe per your request, whatever that would be. But what they were doing is they were hacking into, let's say, processors or assistants that had a public Gmail, a public account, and they would doctor up wiring instructions, look like it was coming from somebody that buyer had been.
It almost is a mirror of what
Exactly.
your email looks
Right.
like.
And in the beginning it was, you could tell it, the verbiage wasn't correct. It was definitely
Didn't sound like the person.
Didn't sound like the person. Punctuation, whatever it might have been. But they got better and better. And then we were looking at clicking on who it was coming from, and you would know that that wasn't it. But they got smart and started adding maybe just a period in there. And so if you were rushing, and certainly as a consumer, you don't know to look for all of
Yes.
these things. So
And you can't imagine that somebody would do that.
steal your money.
Yes.
Right. And I think just the other day on the news, they had finally, because you and I have had this discussion, as has our industries, like it needs to become public knowledge.
Yes.
And it hasn't been. I mean, it's never,
Everyone needs to know about
billions of dollars are lost. And there was a woman somewhere, I believe, down in League City that was on the news, and she fell victim and lost $70,000.
Yes.
By somebody in the transaction that she thought was that person, and she wired it 2 weeks in advance. Everybody's got a DEFCON kind of protocol. We definitely do. That if we know about it, what we go ahead and put forth to try to get that money back. But you have a very small time frame to where you can try to get that money back.
Yeah, you can't. So
You can't screw around. And 2 weeks out, who's thinking about that?
Nobody is.
even has closing costs at that time.
I've seen things before where people will say, wire $10 and make sure
Right.
that the title company gets it. And then once they get it, you have the correct wire. So put your big toe in, but not your whole foot in. And then once they get it, then do that. So that's certainly
so
one
smart. That's so smart. And the other thing is this: just know that title companies, and it's requirements of the state of Texas, their escrows accounts are set up where it will say, Tradition Title Company, LLC escrow account.
Yes.
You're never going to wire to something that is not the name of that company. You're not going to wire it to Maria Oakham.
Yes.
Or some weird LLC name. It should be the name of the company that you're closing.
Yeah, that's
at.
good information.
And that really is the number one thing. If you get wiring instructions that are going to XYZ LLC, guess what? That's fraud. It's got to be. And rule one is always to call the title company, and not on the phone number that's in the tagline on the email. Google the address. Call the phone number that's in Google or whatever search browser you use to make sure that you call. Hopefully, you've had contact with the title company and you have the phone number.
Don't accept an incoming email. And
Never.
don't accept an incoming call. The consumer needs to make the call
Right.
to the title company.
Right.
And I tell people that, and then I worry that they're going to get a phone number off of a fake email
Right.
and call that number.
So Google the number.
Yes.
And call, or better yet, call your realtor.
Yes.
Because your realtor, for sure.
Yes.
You have already had contact with them.
Yeah,
You
and
already
say this
know.
is the number on how to get a hold of Maria,
Right.
and verify that.
Yes.
So moving on, in our first podcast, we talked about some people don't really understand the benefits of a title company or what the cost of the title policy covers. And so I just wanted to talk quickly about the commitment and the policy. So I know we don't have a whole lot of time, and maybe we have a whole separate podcast about this, but can you just share with us quickly that when we open title, we get a commitment, and then they get the policy after closing? So share with us that.
Right. So the title commitment is basically our offer of, we are going to issue this title policy based on the following. It's set into 4 parts. A has to do with the ownership and legal description. B has to do with all of those deed restrictions and certain promulgated language with regards to taxes, etc. C is the one that all my listing agents want to look at, because that has to do with,
I know I kind of open it and go, I got to look at this.
are there liens? And by liens, we mean a loan that's in place, an IRS issue, maybe an HOA lien. Maybe somebody hasn't been paying their HOA dues. That's
Child support.
Child support, big one. Don't see it often, but
Yeah.
we do see it. Anything that's needs to be satisfied. Those are requirements that have to be satisfied. Once those requirements are satisfied, then we can close on the transaction. We can record documents, and after that, then the final policy is issued to the consumer.
And they get that in the mail after closing, maybe about a week after closing. or
About
something?
30 days usually,
Okay.
because they're going to pull in all of the jackets and everything. It's a one-time policy. As long as you own that house, it's in effect. I have a lot of people that go, well, how do I renew this? You don't. It's paid one time, and as long as you own that property, it's in effect.
Yes, and so it's interesting, when you go sell a car, you need to provide your car title.
Right.
To sell, but it's not like that with houses, right? You don't need to provide it, but still it needs to go in a safety deposit box or someplace safe. Whereas if you ever, God forbid, needed to find it, you would have it. But you
Right.
don't need to provide it when you go sell.
Well, and before we had technology, we sent a courier down to the courthouse with all the
I
documents
know.
and a
Can you
list
imagine?
of things, and they stamped it. Well, now we have the original deed. We e-record it. Then as a buyer, you're going to get the owner's title policy with the original deed and the e-record deed.
Yes.
And so I feel like that's kind of the icing on
pretty
the
cool.
cake.
It's pretty cool.
That means you've owned the house.
So I used to tell people 30 days, but it seems like a lot of title companies are sending that policy out
Yep.
because of technology, like in a week or 10 days,
Quick, and it
which is
depends
crazy.
on how busy they are,
Yeah,
right? How
yeah.
busy is your title policy department?
Yes.
And that's the other thing. And
I always tell my customers, though, mark your calendar for 30 days. And if you don't get that title policy in 30 days, call your closer.
yeah, shoot an email or call us, because we want
Yes.
to make sure it gets to you.
Yes, exactly.
And we'll even send an email to you, and then the original will come to you in the mail.
And so, in one of the last 2 things I want to quickly touch on before Tuan kills us and pulls the plug on us, is the survey. So it used to be with every transaction you needed to have a new survey.
Right.
Right? And so they changed those rules, 10 years ago?
10 years ago, yeah,
where
it's been a
you
while.
could use an existing survey provided the seller signed an affidavit saying there were no changes on that survey.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts between using an existing survey or getting a new survey?
There's a whole rule of thought there. I think the one thing that people need to remember is technology is incredible. So a survey that may have been done 10 years ago is not going to look the same as a survey done today. Their measurements are better. Their whole technology is
Much sharper.
And to the pinpoint, right? I mean, you may find a difference of a few feet, of maybe an inch, whatever it is, where the old one, our protocol, as I'm sure most title companies are, is if I have an existing survey, once I get that commitment, I'm going to match that up, meaning I'm going to take Schedule B of that commitment, and I'm going to look at everything that's on there regarding, building lines, any kind of setback lines, easements, and I'm going to make sure that survey has that on there. And if it doesn't, then we're going to need a new
Then you're
survey.
going to need a new one. I think that's super smart because, especially in a lot of the areas where we sell in, and in Meyerland and in Tanglewood and in River Oaks and
Right.
inside the city where these are old established neighborhoods, it may be, the house may show that it's over the building line.
Right.
Because it was an old survey.
Right.
And so then we go get a new survey and we're like, look, it's not.
It's not.
So
Right.
sometimes I think that it's such a big investment that for the cost of a survey, what today, anywhere from 500 to
600, let's say.
then it's a small price to pay.
I agree.
To make sure that you're getting 100% the correct survey, which is nice. Once everybody comes to closing and signs off and all of this, and then everything, some mortgage, if there's a loan, some mortgage companies will have to send the money over to
Right.
you. Sometimes they have sent the money in advance and you just have to send them all the documents before they give you what's called a funding number. And sometimes you don't have to do that. But when it's all funded is when the keys get exchanged and when then it's officially the new buyer's house. And that is very exciting.
That's
and it doesn't always happen on the same day.
It's the best time.
It's
That
the
is
best
the best
time.
time. And it's the best time when the buyer's sitting there at the title company, not when they've had to go back to work or go along their way while we're waiting on. It's the best time is when it's because they're so excited.
They're so excited. You know, there is something a little anticlimactic when you go and you tender all this money if you're the buyer,
know.
and then you walk out with no keys. You're like, at least give me a key.
Give me something.
But at least you'll have the key that you can hold up and
Right.
say, I closed.
Right.
Take a picture.
Because I think to get a loan in this day and age, especially if you're doing, is so incredibly hard,
Yes.
right? It's a lot of work, and kudos to our loan officers because it is a long, arduous path.
Yes.
And so I feel like by the time I can tell you when I'm in closing, and I'm like, I think you probably already signed this document, and people always laugh. They're like, do you know how much I've already signed online? I feel like we've inundate people with paperwork.
Yes, we
that
do.
They exhale
Yes.
at the time. They're like, oh my gosh, we're done. This is it. This is all I have to do now.
So one of my best friend's sons just bought his first home, and he was like, man, my arm hurts, my
Yeah,
hand hurts,
I know.
I had to sign so much. So it is a very thrilling, exciting time. And you know, I always tell people that whether you're doing it for the first time or the 10th time or the 20th time, there is something just very exciting about selling and buying a home. Sometimes it's bittersweet. There's memories left
Right.
behind, etc.
Absolutely.
But you know, at the end of the day, it's mission accomplished, and it's getting the buyer and the seller over the finish line, which is a great sense of pride to be a part of that. And I can tell you that for me, when I put a file at Tradition Title, and I know that you're behind the steering wheel on that transaction, and I have a good lender or it's a cash transaction, I know that I'm going to be there on the date planned, no questions
Right.
asked, and everybody's going to leave happy, hopefully. So that's our goal, and I know that you've seen everything at that closing table, and I think I have too.
As I was going to say, as have you. I mean, as have you.
And so, but we kind of powwow before, and one thing I think that's really special is I'll tell you when I walk into the closing, I'll say, this client of mine is a first-time home buyer, so please explain everything. And even though you always do explain everything, no matter what, you're not one of these people that just puts papers in front of people and say sign. You explain every document, which I so love. But if I tell you that somebody is a first-time home buyer, you really even go above and beyond and really explain it. And with the seller too, you go above and beyond and really explain it. And I think that is one of the many things that sets you apart.
Oh,
So,
thank you. Well, I would want somebody to do the same for me, right? If I didn't understand it, I mean, I ask a lot of questions, as do you.
Yes.
That's probably why we are friends,
Yes.
because we ask questions. But I feel like, you're entitled to that. And if I can't answer your question, especially if it's on loan documents, the lender can answer them. And I
Yes.
tell my buyers, those questions, ask your lender.
Yes.
But I feel like I do love my job and the fact that I get to be this part of somebody's life. And I'm
big
lucky
part.
enough to close on people time and time again where maybe they bought their first home and now they're moving to their bigger home and now they're having children and
then you get to help the children, which then you start
I know.
really feeling.
Now
I'm
we're
not
old.
I'm not
Yeah.
at the grandkids yet.
Yeah, no, I know.
But I am selling homes to my friends'
Kids. Yeah.
which is which is just very surreal, but it's very, very, it's a gift. It really is.
I know.
So, well, thank you for being
Thank
so
you.
great at what you do, so great in working with me and all of us at Bernstein Realty. And I know that we all adore you here, and You really take great care of the customer, which is the number one thing of what we care about. So thank you for everything Title to us. So we appreciate you and
Thank
your
you,
friendship,
Amy.
which means everything.
Thank you, Amy.
So what is it? Your home is our
Our.
expertise. Well, you could say your title is.
Our expertise.
Thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you.